All right, so I'm delighted to have you with us today and an opportunity both to hear from Johannes on this, what I think is a really interesting topic, and then also to have a bit of an opportunity to have a bit of discussion at the end of after that presentation, since we are all here temporally in the same moment, not physically co-located, but temporally co-located, and to take advantage of that opportunity to have a bit of discussion and to connect. Johannes is someone with a long experience in education, in engineering education, particularly. Currently located at the University of Texas at El Paso as executive director and Hopper Dean at the Hopper Dean Center for Excellence in K-12 education. But he has previously been in a number of different institutions and had various roles in engineering education. And Johannes, you'll add to this, I think, but an interest in his research around STEM and STEM innovation in education, around maker culture, and more recently increased focus towards empathy and care in engineering. And I think there are a number of different societal and human reasons to be prioritizing those concerns around empathy and care in the current educational and climate context. So I'm very pleased to have you with us today. And do let me know if there's anything else that I can do to be supportive of the presentation. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over.
Thank you, Ciara, and thank you for inviting me. Just as if you would mind, you're more than welcome to share your comments in the chat because of Teams and other weirdness of presentation mode and stuff. I'm not seeing that much, so I ask Ciara to interrupt me if there's anything I can answer immediately. Otherwise, we can do that at the end. I plan to have a lot of time left at the end. This is when Ciara approached me, she asked me about a paper that I co-authored about nearly now 20 years ago on everyday problem solving. What do engineers do in their world when we send them out there after we educate them? And so this was this is a follow-up presentation on that and maybe a new spin on that. I'm combining it with research that I'm doing currently on humility and curiosity. This is work that sparked or came directly out of my work with empathy and care. We found humility to be a mediating factor of making empathy work, particularly when we are in situations of resistance to change. And then we're full spot in the discomfort area of what is resistance to change. So let me start here. We know from many years of expertise research that to attain exceptional performance, you need about 10,000 hours in 10 years of reflective practice. This has been pretty validated. The question always was, what is the role of education in this? And I call it the business of education, but it may be more the curriculum holy grail. Seems to be what? If we look at many different approaches that we see nowadays, I would say the holy grail of curriculum seems to be acceleration. So we know everybody can become an expert by 10 years practicing as reflective practitioners, but how can we actually speed that up? A lot of our educational enterprise, I think, has been designed around speeding things up. Sure, you can learn that on slower, but how can we find ways where you can attain that much quicker? That has, at least in the US, led to many different curriculum innovations, broadly speaking. So we have dual enrollment. We have some places where high school students come and enter the university as second-year students because they did already enough work in high school. We have the credit by examination, competency learning, so show what you can do and we give you credit for it. a fourth semester. So we have now 4 semesters or shorter semesters in the US. We have accelerated bachelor and combined degree program. We are trying more and increased recognition of micro-credentials. And we're doing, even on the higher end, we're doing a lot of executive doctorate programs. While at the same time, our life expectancy is actually much longer. So we're accelerating on the one hand, trying to get people out. Sure, they should work when they're 21 or 22 and get out into the workplace and be workplace ready and be as quick as possible ready for workplace. While at the same time, we are spending so much more time, our lives in working hours and non-working hours. So why this whole notion of formal education being so compressed? This was something from a wide range of perspectives, always driving somewhat my work. And my work was always about reverse engineering of engineering education. So we know what engineers do, or we need to study what engineers actually do and bring that back into classrooms. And that has been a movement, not just over time, that this is a massive movement. We know so much about bringing engineering in the wild back into classrooms. So we know school problems are oftentimes very well defined. They don't really cause much discomfort. They don't cause much uncertainty unless the uncertainty of where's the formula to apply to solve a particular problem. And we know when we introduce students to real-world problems, real world in quotation marks, we are ending up with unclear data, unknown variables, conflicting constraints. We're dealing with multiple viable solutions, and there is no perfect solution. We know that we as engineers, we often talk about optimal solutions in the given situation. So this has been widely used, this workplace engineering has been widely used to influence undergrad, grad, P12, anything from pre-kindergarten to high school, continuous education programs. This has been a huge driving factor. Part of it was we want to bring in authenticity. We don't want them just to show up as problems in class. We want them to show up as authentic problems in class. And authentic problems, this is an earlier paper on authenticity in engineering education, where we identified 4 different types. There's the context authenticity. So would that be in a similar real world environment? Task authenticity, would you actually do what an engineer would really do? Is it an impact authenticity? Is the only people who see it inside your classroom, your instructor, maybe your college, or is it going outside? Does it have an impact outside of schooling? And then the personal value authenticity of all of these other 3 things might be coming to fruition, but what if you don't care? What it's not really tied to what you are interested in? At this point, we decided, or we formulated a definition of an authentic problem in school, where the primary purpose and source of existence is not to teach or provide a learning situation. The primary purpose and source of existence is not to provide a learning situation. So we, in a way, argued problems should actually make the teacher uncomfortable as well, because this is also not something the teacher designed. This is not something that the teacher selected, possibly selected, but not defined in the way of constraints criteria or the different funny, messy things we deal with when we deal with problems that occur not for learning situations. It came partly also about to keep learning wild, meaning we didn't want necessarily engineering to look like a wolf and then showing up in the classroom as a chihuahua that is domesticated in a handbag, if I want to use that metaphor. This work led to this one paper, Everyday Problem Solving in Engineering, Lessons for Engineering Educators. This is based on a design theory by my former PhD advisor, David Jonathan, where it is about looking at problems are not the same. Problems have a wide range of dimensions to them, from abstract to situated, from well-structured to ill-structured, from simple to complex, static to dynamic, context-dependent to context-independent, and you could place different type of problems on that space. And you could actually, we haven't done that at that time, but you could actually pretty much put a line in the middle and declare the top part the uncertainty discomfort area, and the bottom part the more comfortable, well-known spaces. This was a study we did with professional engineers in the United States. And we looked at how do they do problem solving in their own world, in their own space. We found they do ill-structured problems, much more complex, unanticipated problems showed up a lot more than unanticipated ones. We saw different ways of problem solving. Success was really measured often by non-engineering standards, something that I have found later in studies what puzzled most of my undergraduate students that I researched when they went to co-ops, for example, workplace placement learning, that non-engineering standards were actually apparently more important than engineering standards on some level. But it created so much uncertainty of processes, outcomes, constraints, dynamic. It's just so ever-changing when you work on these problems. There is a little bit of tidbit. Sometimes we don't talk about how we do research and what shows up. So you see in the data collection on this slide where I say we used 106 structured interviews, but only 97 were usable. We interviewed professional engineers who had the professional engineering designation. We recruited them widely. We did our interviews. We anonymized the data. And then when we analyzed, we found there was a subset of interviews that just didn't make any sense compared to the other ones. Very different, very differently defining. So we de-anonymized again and found, oh, the interviews that were so different were actually from engineers who were academics, not engineers who worked in industry. So just to indicate again this whole notion of what do we bring in, what is engineering in universities was pretty much put on a highlight there of, yes, that is very different, even if we didn't anticipate that ourselves. We followed up that with a study that was a study then done extending this, because the other paper ended with, well, most problems are not that neatly definable as the design theory would indicate. They're meta problems, or then we called them compound problems. Compound problems are this funny notion of we're working at any time, not just on a single one of these problems, like troubleshooting, for example. The state of where a system is very clearly understood, right? It's not working. What exactly is not working is very not understood. The process to get there is a series of very well-structured tests. And at the end, when you did your very well-structured tests, you have an hypothesis, you test that, and then maybe how to solve the issue is again a very ill-structured component. So we're constantly, the hypothesis for this paper was, we're constantly interacting with problems that are creating a level of discomfort because they're ill-structured and uncertain, but have also components in there that seemed very well structured, very comfortable, very well noticed of what they are actually requiring of me, where others do not require that. This is based on an ethnographic study where I tagged along an engineer for a year, following him what he was doing when he was designing steel mills and troubleshooting steel mills all around the world. What the interesting part was that, of course, intertwined problems exist, but they're actually intertwined in ill-structured and well-structured elements. They separate, we really need to separate between problem processes to understanding problems, problem solving, and problem solution processes. These are very distinctly different things. What was also surprising was that actually this transition between these problem types, so I'm working on something, I'm running a huge battery of tests on a system that doesn't function properly. Now I'm getting closer to the end to it. What do I do next? That transition from a very well-structured activity to an ill-structured activity is actually its own problem type. What do I do now in these transition spaces? We also found that this seamless switching between different problem types and modes and solving strategies is really an indicator for expertise. If you look on the right side, we see different graphs. The one was how many problems were non-intertwined, how many were intertwined, and how many intertwined problems existed in there. But if you look here in the bar D, the transition was actually the problem. It was not that it wasn't a very clear what to do, but what to do next. This led this work on problems in the workplace, how do we incorporate real-world authentic problem solving, led to a lot of curricular innovations, for example, problem-based, project-based learning. This is from a large-scale study where we did a meta-synthesis of meta-analyses on problem-based learning. This is just indicating we know on many different levels that problem-based learning works. We know it works for non-performance and skill assessment. We know it works very well for long-term knowledge assessment, less so for short-term assessment. We know it works for performance assessment, mixed knowledge, a wide range where actually PBL or problem-based learning is actually favored. The effect sizes favor problem-based learning. So in a way we know that, and we have seen a lot of introduction of this particular curriculum innovation in universities. Now I want to juxtapose that with two stories from our current research on humility and curiosity. Humility, curiosity, they're often described as either emotion plots or virtues. Emotion plots are stories in which you, when you encounter them, when you're right in the middle of something unfolding, it creates a huge amount of emotion. Virtues as more of a character trait, and there's a lot more coming out nowadays in virtue education and how it also connects to engineering education. Humility in this way is defined as insights of limits of one's own knowledge, openness to alternative ideas, that you can present your own idea non-offensively and receive information non-defensively. Curiosity as the very broadly defined as urge to know more. Now it's interesting because both of them, if you sense into that, what emotions they hold and what reactions you might have, they both hold a tremendous amount of discomfort and uncertainty. The humility requires you to hold, I possibly don't know, an acknowledgement of uncertainty of my own knowledge. And the curiosity is that knowing that and the discomfort of going out to learn something new without knowing what I might actually get. So both of them have a very direct relationship to this overall speaker series on discomfort and uncertainty. These are things we encounter all the time. A little bit of a story, my 11-year-old son, he came back from school and he's very uncomfortable in school. He has reading issues, and a lot of things are just very uncomfortable for him in school. It was eye-opening for him that he actually, when he learned that school by definition is assuming you might not know. Every day is a space where you learn actually something new. It's fascinating that a kid wouldn't see school as a place of, I'm constantly living in a space of not knowing and learning something new. He thought that was a space where I hang out with friends, where we address things, and most of the time we are addressing things that the teacher assumes already that I might know. So, and if I don't know, I feel bad about myself. I mean, if you can imagine the notion, what does it mean for a student to come to school, to university, and has constantly the feeling, I should know more than I do because everybody else pretends they do, or some of them do know more, but my constantly not knowing is actually a severe threat in this environment. What does it do to a student? Instead of the celebration of, we're actually all here because we don't know anything or very little, and we could actually build on that. And let's rather elaborately determine what is it that we don't know. So in continuing for these two stories, we in a bigger interview that had many other components, we prompted students with the following questions. Let's say you're working on a 6-week project and you're in week 5. Somebody comes in and points out, first of all, I think you misunderstood the assignment. What do you do? Or, here's a new idea, and you actually immediately see it would dramatically improve the project. What would you do? And here's a new idea, but you're not sure. You might have to investigate to find out the value of that idea that somebody mentioned by looking at your project, by engaging with you. What would you react? How would you react? What would you do? If you think for a moment, how would you react, right? This is, as much as we know from empathy, we always talk about empathy as a way of understanding somebody else's emotions, standing in somebody else's shoes. Actually, the one part in emotion and empathy work that we have oftentimes forgotten is actually knowing your own emotion in that space is extremely important as well. So what's your own reaction to, I think you misunderstood the assignment when you're in week 5 of 6 in a project? You spent 5 weeks already working on that. What do you think when somebody shows up and says, here's a new idea, and you're like, geez, I wish I would have come up with that myself. I know exactly what you're talking about. That is brilliant. I don't know how to do it. Or, yeah, it's fascinating the take you took on the project, and I don't know, there might be a lot of value in there. Our students that we interviewed, first of all, expressed that oftentimes very specific, and sometimes it looked like when I interviewed them, very narrow ideas or curiosity brought them to college. Like I interviewed one student who was like, I came here to understand something very specifically about waves, electromagnetic waves. And once I got that in my junior year, in my 3rd year of university, I kind of turned off because I understood something that I really was curious right from the beginning. students expressed often that their degree plan and the rigidity of it does not really provide the opportunity to excel in curiosity. Curiosity is stopped by performance. Particularly, it seemed to be hard to think about being curious in mastery-oriented or classes of their majors. I remember one student, for example, saying, curiosity happens in electives. That's the classes I choose because of interest. They don't happen in my major. We're going there so many things through. And even in project-based and problem-based work, I don't have time. There was a huge sense that curiosity is very utilitarian. It has to quickly lead to something. It's so, in a way, students felt, as they expressed to us, there is this notion of, yeah, we're encouraged to explore and be creative and having new ideas and innovation, but remember in 5 weeks your project is due. So keep that kind of in check. Keep that, make sure you're not just following some curiosity, but there gotta be a product at the end of the day. Otherwise, you're not passing the class or you're not succeeding in your studies. And then there was an interesting disconnect between schoolwork where students felt, yeah, I'm trying to be humble in a way. Here are a lot of characteristics of what it means to be humble. Actually, our students had more examples of non-humble behavior. They encountered so many from many others than humble behaviors. But they found this huge disconnect when they're working on a project, they can explore, they can be freely saying they don't know, and then they present the project and have to sell themselves. Like, we figured that out, and we figured that out, and we did that. And it even showed up then in job interviews, right, where they had to convince people to hire them versus a colleague who might be, who might, in their opinion, might be better suited, but they still want the job. So they have to tell otherwise, right? Interesting conflicts that created. Discomfort with the notion of I have to show myself less humble than I'm actually are, or less humble than I see myself. We probably hear, and these are just quotes at the end, instead of properly doing an assignment, doing it very quickly, maybe just copying from somebody else. And if not, then just try to get done as quickly as possible, right? So these are statements you probably hear from students or you hear in hallways when people work. It's a constant negotiation of doing it better and doing it in the time given to them. So I would argue there are some unintended consequences of this real-world problem solving in universities. There is a fixation on deadlines over learning, prioritizing deadlines over truly understanding concepts. We sense a lot of students, and my experience with students is they feel rushed in many different ways. The product over process mentality. I don't know how many times the product at the end of a project-based learning environment, the product was so center. We have a showcase coming up, we have industry coming in, we need to show the colleagues how well our students do products. And what about process artifacts? What about focusing on process? The deliverables seem to sometimes discourage experimentation, deep learning. It can lead to burnout and stress. The pressure of performing is, we have a lot of research right now on well-being, student well-being, which shows the pressure to perform is extremely high. We know from research that being in a constant level of stress is not really good for your creativity. It's not good for innovation. So real adherence to real-world constraints might stifle innovation, might stifle actually risk-taking. Particularly, and this is my main argument, particularly in an environment that is actually designed to be a risk-taking environment, a environment that should not live under a perform or die, perform or wash out environment. This is a learning environment. This is not a real-world performance environment. And we come to that a little bit more. There's an unbalanced workload of managing academic and professional style responsibilities. And I see that in myself as well. I worked with students in project-based, problem-based learning environments. And the closer we come to the end of the semester, if you watch us in a room of teaching staff and students, you wouldn't know a difference of who is staff and who is student. And at the end, there's this really awkward feeling of, well, somebody gives now a grade and somebody determines how successful you were. And somebody is basing that on product, and we don't really collect process information about their learning process progression. Might be unequal opportunities. Do students really have the same access to resources, to mentors, as having the right access to people who say, you know, just explore, or what are your criteria for that? Asking questions in that space is truly important. Otherwise, you know, when we defined expertise before as it's only working under reflective practitioner, the reflection element becomes extremely important. It's actually not the practice, it's a reflective practice that makes experts. There might be ethical dilemmas when working on real-world problems. They might come into controversial or morally complex situations without proper guidance because they show up in the tiny little bits. There's a lot of research on ethics that shows we have spent way too much time on ethics, on big disaster, catastrophe ethics cases like the Challenger explosion and this dam is breaking, when actually ethics happens on an everyday basis on a slippery slope where you slowly sliding down. Now, what proper guidance do we provide students in the slippery slope of their project work when they encounter ethicality issues? And this might be a little bit controversial to say there could be an industry bias in education. I know we're trying to align our work so much with industries, but we might unintentionally shape curricula to meet very specific corporate needs rather than fostering independent critical thinkers who can work across corporations. So here's a little story for that. We once got, when I worked at a major engineering education university in the US, we got asked by one of the big American car manufacturers that we're not doing a well enough job because they have to retrain people when they come to their environment. So we asked them, that's perfectly fine. Why don't you open your books? Show us what you want them to learn. Oh, no, that's completely, that's proprietary. We can show you, but we can scold you for not preparing our students well enough for an environment that they would not actually share what it actually looks like. What is the role of education, right? What is the role of university? I'm not arguing we should be completely detached from what industry needs are. Far from it. But I'm not educating people for company X. I'm not educating people for a particular sector of industry. I'm broadly educating, and there's oops, am I back? I just got some weird message. You can still hear me all?
Yeah,
okay.
It was all good.
All right. I don't know. I just got a bleep. This was Microsoft trying to interject. I made here too much of a criticism of industry and corporations. So educational spaces are different. And I would actually argue educational spaces should be artificial. There are not natural spaces. There are not natural working spaces. There should be spaces where there is time. And this is just, time to explore, time to wander, time to ponder, time to look closely, more closely than actually we might do in other spaces. Time to share, time to pay attention, time to, you can fill in the blank of what you think students don't spend enough time on, or where you think you might not be able to provide your students with enough time to do X. And this is not just about quantity of time, it's about the quality of what we do in these educational times. So the big question for me, I leave for myself, is what from this outside world of industry, what of this outside world of real world problems do we need and want in the classroom? And what actually do we not need? And what do we not want from outside? All right. I hope I leave enough time for questions. Any questions, comments, concerns, ideas? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Johannes, for this really interesting overview and landing with a really different, for me, quite a different idea about where we're supposed to be going with education, of putting together those pieces in a way that is a really nice basis for asking a really interesting question, related absolutely to uncertainty and discomfort, and to so many other really relevant themes in engineering education at the moment. So Johannes has just given us a really open question here in terms of your ideas. So I've given you a tiny little summary here. So maybe there's some questions, maybe some of your thoughts are about the uncertainty or humility or curiosity, and those educational design decisions about how we're setting up those contexts that students are learning in, and also about that difference between the educational systems and job and authentic contexts. So I think it works if you raise your little hand at the top there. So for me, it's at the top of my view. You can raise a little purple hand, and then that will automatically come in order, which will be useful. All right. So Paul Jones, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really, really interesting. I was just wondering how you felt, if the sort of the link that one could make with this slowing down of educational processes with the rise of artificial intelligence, saying that there are going to be so many like technical tasks and things like that that are going that risk becoming very automated. That just kind of like, how do you sort of see the place of artificial intelligence? Should that actually make us more aware to a certain extent of this slowing down of educational processes for our independent critical thinkers?
Yeah, appreciate the comment. I mean, this is something that absolutely is on the forefront right now on our thinking of artificial intelligence. I find it interesting that it's called artificial intelligence and not artificial wisdom, because there is a bit of a difference between, there's a lot of use of these technologies and tools that I actually can see helping speeding things up. where I don't have to necessarily speed up. So I love the notion of AI as a cognitive tool, as a tool that extends my own cognitive abilities, because I'm using it to offload some of the work, maybe some of the busy work, some of the work that I should have not done in the first place because it takes a lot of time. But, like, for example, the engineer that I followed in ethnography, he in the middle of a day, he got so bored while you worked with him and he was so busy. And when you ask him, he was like, well, I know exactly what to do for the next 6 hours. I know exactly what I'm going to do. And that is boring. So if he would have had something to do that work, he could have spent his time more pondering things that would have been more interesting for him. Because he was just waiting for results, right? But he had to do all the motions of the testing and the measurement and everything, and he knew exactly what that looked like. And that was, I think, if we can offload boring stuff, I think we'll encounter there's a lot more non-boring stuff that we're still actually pretty well occupying ourselves with, and hopefully we'll actually spend more time on non-boring stuff than on boring stuff. And I'm happy AI is taking over some of the boring stuff.
Thank you very much.
And Ben Hill?
Yeah, I want to say again, thanks for this talk. It's been great. I'm interested in this conflict between this idea of the learning environment as a risk-taking enterprise, something which requires risk-taking, if I understand it correctly, against this kind of production mindset, which tends to be typical of potentially education in general and maybe engineering education more particularly. And especially I wondered if you could talk about this idea of slowing down, allowing risk-taking in a context where maybe you're the only educator that's doing that, or maybe it's just your department that's doing that, or maybe your field is doing that, or maybe all of the previous studies of the students have been sort of production oriented, and to what degree you think that change can be made at a local level, or it's really more, or if it's really more of a kind of a cultural, a much wider thing in terms of how this change could come about.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and when you ask it, it reminded me of questions I got like years ago on, well, what about if we're the only place that does problem-based learning and we're the only one, right, who brings suddenly ill-structured, complex problems into classrooms? And it created a lot of discomfort, and it created students who were saying like, you're taking something away from me. You take away me knowing what makes me here successful. Right, and this is we have seen that so many times when you're trying to suddenly do something else in education. And it's not just problem-based learning, that you create an uncertainty of what does success look like. And so I think from the lessons from that is that you can do that on a localized level when you are actually declaring spaces as such, and when you're actually being consistent with that. And we have seen problem-based learning classrooms operating within larger educational structures. We have seen programs operating in faculties or colleges that don't operate in its entirety in that, and they have been successful. So I think the notion that there are different spaces for students might also be something worthwhile for them to encounter, as much as they encounter differences on their instructional staff. If you come to my class, I'll teach differently than somebody else, and I need to adjust. And students, I think, would adjust. And we just have to make sure we are also declaring what are the boundaries of that space.
Thank you very much for the response.
You're just asking hypothetically there. Yeah, Ben?
Obviously,
Obviously.
totally hypothetically.
I could tell. Luis, Adriano.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to thank you, your presentation, because as a teacher, university teacher of engineering, very often we are kind of feeling guilty or sometimes even blamed because we are too academic. So, of course, PBL is the solution. But you mentioned the opposite extreme, when we are too applied, too practical, too corporate. So I guess you have risen the attention for the need for a balance between both approaches, not too academic, not too practical. And I think this is very wise what you said, and it will be very useful for me in the future. Very many thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Johannes, do you want to take a minute to read the comment that's just come in the chat?
Yes. Yeah, thank you about that comment with the car manufacturing industry. Yes, exactly. This large manufacturer thought, why am I educating people on proprietary processes, and then they end up working for the competition, right? So even industry realizes that they cannot offload their entire corporate training into universities. So it is the question, what are we actually preparing that helps the vast majority of students to be successful in a most maximum situation of context in which they later work. And that is a very, very different question than preparing them even for a job that currently exists. Most of our work is preparing people for jobs that don't exist in 10 years. We're preparing them for jobs that we don't know yet will come. So it can't be just job preparation. It can't be just competency for existing work processes. So, and then critical thinking and aspects of comparing and contrasting is becoming much more important. And that needs different spaces to develop. It's not, and I like what Luis said, it's not an either or, right? This is not a just be purely academic, ivory tower. We hear so many arguments about universities being absolutely, useless. This is not about retracting in some ivory tower. It's also not just putting campus into into a corporate headquarter. But it is finding a balance that allows for spaces to develop, our students to develop things that we find valuable because we are having a wider and a broader view than a narrow corporate agenda. And corporations have benefited for centuries on education, taking not a corporate view on education. They benefited from it, right? They might not always like it, but they benefited from it.
And Uta, did you have a question? I think you had your hand up for a minute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
And I hope you see me now. Well, I'm thinking about the assessment, and that summative assessment, especially through grades, build up pressure. And I'm thinking about, well, do we always have to access everything? And where is some freedom or some space to give to the students, and to give also to us, to go deeper into problems and to deal with open problems? Maybe you have a comment on this. And thank you very much for your presentation. You spoke from my heart.
Oh, thank you. Well, you absolutely, I mean, that whatever I'm presenting here and this larger question, of course, it becomes hugely important when it comes to assessment, right? I mean, that assessment is driving so much. And I think it requires some level of looking at different ways to assess. I'm not arguing for a free for all, let's ponder, and at the end we all acknowledge you have nicely pondered in whatever way we can measure that, and you're good to go, right? I think there is a lot of still about how you ponder. There's a rigor in pondering. There's a rigor in critical thinking. There's a rigor in competencies that we are employing while doing these things. And that's something I think we need to think of. What are our process assessments that would allow us a more nuanced view? And I'm also very aware, right? What I'm presenting is also, for some students, they need a very well structured, let me just know what I need, and environment. And not everybody comes to the university and is super motivated to follow their own curiosity and explore the world. It's like somebody mentioned way in the beginning of the chat, people come in and say, I have no idea what I want to get out of this place, right? We need spaces for them also to be guided, to be more well structured, because it is about individual student growth and not fitting also that model completely. Everybody has to now fit this free-range chicken approach of finding your own learning kind of way and looking for your own things. So this is an assessment becomes hugely interesting and hugely important to rethink as well.
And Karia Yusuf, sorry, I might be mispronouncing your name. You have a question or a comment?
Yes. Hello, Johannes. Nice to hear from you again.
Yes, likewise.
Yes. Yeah. This is really, really interesting to think about this again. But there's been a lot of work focusing on the students, and it's still endless. You were talking about the balance between having structure and give like the free range kind of students, which there's actually a balance to it that we as faculty have to think about. And now, apart from the challenge of the unknown, there's also the challenge that we know that instructors face in trying to get this right. And a lot of times we don't have time to ponder over how to teach our students best. So, any ideas or any work that you've seen in supporting faculty, you were talking about just now, that those ill-structured problems do not only make the students uncomfortable, they also make the instructors uncomfortable. So, and in trying to do our best for our students, there's also the challenges of the workplace, of the institutions, the jobs itself, the requirement that there's other things other than teaching. But so just to know if you have seen anything regarding on how to better support faculty, how to better support instructors in handling the challenge of these uncertainties now.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because this is not an equation that just deals with what do we do for students and how do we prepare them well. I think looking, and I'm working right now in the US American context, right, where higher education is being challenged on every corner. And I think there's a lot of things that need reform, not just on how we teach, but also on what are requirements for our instructional and research staff. I mean, where do we start, right? I mean, this is the notion of publish and perish has been produced so many incremental paper production of, what would be if you don't publish every year 5 things, but rather 1, and combine things and don't try to look for the smallest publishable unit of your work, right? Do we have enough space on the other side, right? And this is I'm not trying to mention here any cheap solutions, because I don't think the space warrants or can even handle cheap solutions. It needs to be something we also have to give ourselves space and time. And here in the US, it feels sometimes we're running currently out of time to actually think about these things before something really dramatically happens. But we need to have these conversations, and at least we need to have a understanding that these conversations actually need to happen. That and what you bring up, Herrera, is this has to be a space where faculty have to be front and center involved in what that means for them and how we support them in their venturing when they go into their classrooms. Yes.
And sorry, just we're getting very close to the end. Ben, you're back again.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to monopolize the talking time here. I do want to ask you about, you mentioned there's an anecdote you had about your son, if I remember rightly, where this idea of convincing, or just at least putting the idea in his head that the learning institution was a place where you go to be uncomfortable, a place you go to learn things, and being uncomfortable or not knowing or admitting that you don't know is perfectly normal. And this is, of course, not, I'm sure we're all aware, not confined to 11-year-olds or younger. I mean, have you got any sort of tools or concrete tools or experience or other anecdotes about ways of convincing students that that's what they're here for?
I usually in my own class, when I start, I do a couple of activities. The one thing that I noticed is when I'm walking into a classroom, there's immediately an hierarchy involved, right? I'm the one grading. I'm the one who, in their views, I'm the one watching them and judging them at the end. I have found it very helpful when I'm actually standing in front of them saying, I don't know. You ask me a brilliant question, or maybe it's not so brilliant question, but I couldn't tell you right now which one it is. And so why don't we explore, and then coming actually back the next time and say, like, here is what I found out between our last time and this time, and I might made myself look into things, not on your behalf, but because I was curious too in what that actually means. I taught once a class where half the class was on prepared material. The other half the class was completely student question driven. So every week in the discussion board, part of the requirement was to ask questions. And half my lecture time, half my class within them was spent just on answering questions. And I showed them how I actually looked for answers. And most of it was like, well, this is one answer and there's another, and you find a competing answer here. So I'm also trying to be very careful in how many truths I'm going to tell them, right? This notion of this, and this ties into other work like epistemological belief. People come into particularly early undergraduate students come into classrooms to look for a single truth. And if you don't provide them, you're a bad teacher, right? And the notion of I give you more of a process, how I arrived at something, and then being actually super cautious, even if it is a currently more established frame of my discipline. I'm being overly cautious of saying this is the current state and that might actually change. And this notion of what you learn is not stable gives a sense of, well, if the notion what we know is not stable, how can you expect me to be stable and stable in knowing something? So it has a lot to do with language, but it has a lot to do with process, making our own processes of how we arrive at learning ourselves as faculty more transparent. I don't think they see us working. They see us, yes, they see us working as in sense of talking to them and teaching them something that we think has value. But I don't think they see us struggling with understanding of complexities and showing that and saying, like, this is how I would do a particular solution. I had a colleague who did a wonderful thing. That colleague brought in 2 other colleagues whom he knew would have a very different approach. And he took one of these ill-structured problems and they were just debating for an hour and annotating it, right? Giving in more information, more material. It was prepared. But students walked out and they're like, I don't know what to do now. They can't agree on it, right? And that was like an open space for them. Like, wait, if they agree, then if they disagree, and there are certain commonalities on how they actually act and how they frame it, was eye-opening for them. They thought we're just sitting on the same well of truth and just, have our golden cups we drink from and then spit it back out to them. That was unknown for them, that we actually had academic debates, that we might have very different views of how to tackle something. And they're not just variations, they're actually contradictory to each other.
So thank you all for managing to organize your day to be here with us, co-located in this moment. As Alexandra said, this recording will be available on the SEFI YouTube channel. That usually takes about a week. So if you want to come back and revisit any of it or to share it with anyone else, it will be there. I'm not rushing away this minute, but we're a little bit past the hour now, and I suspect that other people may have some firm constraints. So thank you so much for being with us here. It would be lovely to see you in May when Fiona Rao from the University of Toronto will be talking to us about questions about equity and what failure means and that discomfort means for students who are facing a lot of discomfort outside of the classroom, how that comes into the classroom for them. And then Johan and Johannes in May will speak to us about more of the emotional aspects of epistemic discomfort. So, but if you can't be there, you can also access those ones as a recording as well. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Johannes, for this really lovely and interesting presentation that's got lots of discussion and questions that are interesting academic questions, and I think also the really practical part about how we bring that into our teaching, into the classroom, and the types of educational systems that we're setting up is really great. So thank you all for being here. Excellent. I appreciate that Joachim is going to start thinking now. So a pleasure to be with you. If you've got more questions and if Johannes has another moment, then it would be lovely to continue that. And if not, I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. And you can always send me an email too if you have any further questions.